Imagine for a second that you are trapped in a courtroom. It's not a modern courtroom.
Right.
It's early 16th century. And the star witness testifying against this brutal, iron-fisted conqueror isn't a living, breathing human being. It's a diary.
Which is a crazy concept to wrap your head around.
Yeah, exactly. Or imagine an entirely different scenario for a second. You are hiding inside a wooden barrel, cramped in the pitch-black hold of a leaking ship, desperately fleeing from debt collectors.
A literal stowaway.
A stowaway, yeah, with zero prospects.
Yeah.
You're completely unaware that within a few short years, the survival instincts you are about to unleash will quite literally redraw the map of the entire world.
It is the ultimate collision of absolute desperation and staggering historical consequence. And the terrifying part is, how deeply intertwined those two things actually are.
Totally. So, welcome to another deep dive. Today we are plunging headfirst into the sweltering, really unforgiving jungles of the 16th century Isthmus of Panama. And for you listening right now, buckle up, because this is a story that reads exactly like a premium cable political thriller.
Oh, absolutely. It really does.
At its core, it is a story centered on a toxic, intensely personal rivalry between two fiercely opposed men. We're talking about Vasco Núñez de Balboa and Pedrarias Dávila.
And you truly could not invent two men more, diametrically opposed in their philosophy, their methods, and just their sheer physical presence. I mean, it's a clash that defined an entire era.
Okay, so let's unpack this. We have a massive stack of historical sources in front of us today, right?
We do, yeah, lots to get through.
We are pulling from the official chronicles of 16th century writers like Gonzalo Fernández de Oviedo and Peter Martin de Anghiera. We're integrating geographical data about the Darien Gap, and we're also layering in modern anthropological and archaeological insights into the indigenous societies of that region.
Right, getting the full picture.
Exactly.
Right.
Our mission for this deep dive is to figure out how the power struggle between this bankrupt stowaway and this rigid, aging aristocrat didn't just shape early colonial administration. It triggered an absolute demographic collapse for the Quarequá people caught in their crossfire, and it literally changed the physical boundaries of the known world.
What we're really examining here is the mechanics of history.
Yeah.
How do monumental shifts actually happen on the ground? Because the maps we rely on today, those clean lines separating continents and oceans, they weren't drawn by noble explorers pointing gracefully at the horizon.
No, definitely not.
They were carved out through bureaucratic paranoia, sheer survivalism, and frankly, horrific violence.
So let's ground this in the physical reality first. Set the scene for us.
Yeah.
Is the early 1500s, we were looking at the Isthmus of Panama.
Right, so this is that incredibly narrow, 50-mile-wide strip of land that acts as a land bridge connecting North and South America. And in the minds of the European powers who were just arriving at the time, this place was a paradox. It was simultaneously viewed as a treasure house and an absolute graveyard.
Graveyard, yeah, because they kept failing, right?
Precisely. The Spanish were operating on rumors and these brief glimpses of wealth along the coastline. They knew there was gold, but getting to that gold meant interacting with a biome, a jungle environment that was actively, relentlessly hostile to their entire way of life.
Right, the environment itself was fighting back.
The very technology that gave them an advantage in Europe, heavy armor and formations, became a deadly liability in Panama.
I really want to dig into that concept of technology failing. Because before our main character, Balboa, even enters the picture, there are these high-profile, incredibly well-funded European expeditions that just catastrophically fail.
Right, massive failures.
Let's look at Rodrigo de Bastidas in 1501. He sails along the Caribbean coast of Panama. He finds gold. He maps the coastline. But he doesn't lose his fleet to like an enemy armada or a massive storm.
No, not at all.
His ships are literally eaten alive from the bottom up.
Eaten by the Teredo shipworm, and this perfectly illustrates the biological reality defeating the European technological reality. The Teredo isn't actually a worm, though. It's a species of marine bivalve mollusk.
Wait, like a clam?
Exactly. It's essentially a clam that has evolved to look and act like an underwater termite.
Wait, hold on. A clam that acts like a termite. How does a clam destroy an entire 16th century caravel?
It's a fascinating biological mechanism. The Teredo uses its tiny shell to just bore into these submerged wooden hulls of ships. Once inside, it secretes enzymes that digest the cellulose of the wood.
Oh, wow.
But here is the truly insidious part. They don't destroy the exterior surface. They honeycomb the inside of the timber. So to a Spanish captain looking over the side of his ship, the hull looks perfectly solid.
But it's actually completely hollow inside.
Right. The structural integrity has been completely hollowed out.
So the moment the ship hits a rough wave or, I don't know, tries to carry a heavy cargo of supplies, the wood just turns to wet paper and shatters.
Exactly. Bastidas barely escaped with his life. He had to abandon ships and limp his way to Hispaniola. So the immediate lesson the Spanish learned was that the Panamanian environment will literally dissolve the floor beneath your feet.
That is terrifying. And if the biology of the ocean doesn't get you, the people defending their homeland absolutely will. Because just a year after Bastidas, in 1502, Christopher Columbus himself shows up.
Yes, his fourth and final voyage.
Right, and this is his disastrous fourth voyage. He tries to plant a colony on the Veraguas coast of Panama, a settlement he named Santa Maria de Belén. This is the guy credited with discovering the Americas, heavily backed by the crown, and his attempt to establish a foothold is an unmitigated disaster.
We really have to look at the mechanics of Columbus's failure here, because he was operating on a top-down, rigid corporate structure. He had a royal charter. He was hunting for a navigable strait to Asia and attempting to extract gold through immediate dominance.
Like, I'm in charge, give me the gold, basically.
Exactly. But he collided with an organized, highly effective indigenous resistance, led by a paramount chief known to the Spanish as El Quibian.
Let me push back on that a bit, though, because, the Spanish had steel armor, early firearms like arquebuses and crossbows. How does an indigenous leader without that specific military technology force the admiral of the ocean sea to just pack up and run?
Because El Quibian recognized the strategic vulnerability of the Spanish, Columbus's men were tethered to their ships into a static settlement. They didn't know the terrain.
So he used the home field advantage.
Completely. El Quibian utilized guerrilla tactics. He cut off their food supplies, launched coordinated ambush attacks in the dense jungle where Spanish cavalry and tight infantry formations were totally useless.
You can't ride a horse through dense jungle underbrush.
Exactly. He made the cost of occupation so astronomically high in terms of blood and starvation that Columbus had no choice but to abandon the settlement and flee. Panama had completely broken Columbus.
Which perfectly sets the stage for the year 1510. Bastidas' ships were eaten. Columbus was chased out. The official, royally sanctioned, well-funded expeditions are all collapsing.
They're a mess.
And into this vacuum steps Vasco Núñez de Balboa. But Balboa's not an admiral. He's not a grand explorer with a royal charter. He is a washed-up, bankrupt, debt-ridden settler living in Hispaniola, which is today the Dominican Republic and Haiti.
A total nobody, essentially.
Right. The man owes so much money that the local authorities have essentially put a bounty on his head.
He is a man with absolutely nothing left to lose. And if you look at the broader history of colonial frontiers, men with zero social capital and nothing to lose are often the ones who fundamentally change the game.
Because they have to.
Right. They succeed because they simply cannot afford the luxury of playing by the established bureaucratic rules.
Exactly. If he stays in Hispaniola, he goes to debtor's prison, or worse. So he decides to flee. He smuggles himself onto a relief ship commanded by a lawyer named Martin Fernandez de Enciso. The ship is bound for a struggling mainland colony called San Sebastian.
And this is where the famous barrel story comes in.
Yes. The traditional historical account, and it's such a brilliant visual, is that Balboa hid inside a large wooden cask, or a barrel, down in the dark, suffocating hold of the ship.
It's worth noting here, because it comes up in so many popular histories, that there is this myth that his famous war dog, Leoncico, was squeezed into the barrel with him.
Oh, right, like a man and his giant dog in one barrel.
Yeah, but the primary sources clarify that this is a later romantic embellishment. The dog was absolutely real and terrifying, which we'll get to.
Yeah.
But the reality of a grown man stowing away in a 16th century ship's hold is grim and cramped enough without trying to wrestle a massive mastiff into the barrel with you.
So they are at sea, and out of the barrel pops Balboa. Enciso, the lawyer in charge of the expedition, is understandably furious. He threatens to maroon Balboa on the first deserted island they pass.
Which was a common punishment.
But Enciso eventually realizes he needs every able-bodied veteran he can get, because when they arrive at the mainland colony of San Sebastian, it is a living nightmare.
The colony was in total collapse. The settlers were literally starving to death. They were completely surrounded and pinned down by local indigenous groups who utilized poisoned arrows.
Oh, wow. So they couldn't even leave the beach.
Right. It was a repetition of the Columbus failure. The top-down, legally mandated approach to conquering the environment was resulting in a total wipeout.
But here is where Balboa's past actually saves them. Remember Bastidas, the guy whose ships were eaten by worms?
Yep, the Teredo incident.
Balboa had actually been a crew member on that 1501 voyage. He remembered sailing along this coast. He tells the desperate, starving men at San Sebastian, "Look, I remember a place across the Gulf of Urubá. The land is fertile, the local people don't use poisoned arrows, and we can actually survive there."
And this is a pivotal moment in the mechanics of colonial power. Balboa is proposing that they abandon the royally sanctioned settlement and move to a completely new location.
But Enciso, the lawyer, refuses, right?
Yeah, he has a royal charter that says this is where the colony is, and legally they cannot leave. He's tied to the paperwork.
So how does a stowaway with no legal standing persuade a colony to overthrow a royally appointed lawyer? Doesn't the crown just execute mutineers?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, this is where Balboa reveals his political genius. He doesn't just launch a violent mutiny, he uses a brilliant loophole in Castilian law.
A loophole?
Yes. Balboa argues that by crossing the Gulf of Urubá to the new location he suggested, they were technically leaving the geographical jurisdiction granted to Enciso by the king.
Oh, wow. So he's arguing a technicality, like, you're the mayor of San Sebastian, but we aren't in San Sebastian anymore.
Exactly. And under Spanish law at the time, if Spanish citizens found themselves in a new territory without a formally appointed royal governor, they had the legal right to form a cabildo, a municipal town council, and they could elect their own magistrates. So Balboa convinces the desperate men to cross the Gulf. They found the new town of Santa Maria la Antigua del Darien. They immediately form a cabildo, and they literally vote Enciso out of power and vote Balboa in.
That is wild.
He used the lawyer's own legal system to stage a bloodless coup.
Think of Balboa as the ultimate rogue startup founder. You know, the legacy mega corporations like Columbus Inc. came in with their rigid business plans, their massive overhead, and their insistence on following the corporate charter even as the ship was literally sinking. They failed.
That's a great way to put it.
Balboa shows up with zero funding, hiding in a barrel. He realizes the original business model, San Sebastian, is a death trap. So he ignores the board of directors, uses a legal loophole to fire the CEO, and successfully pivots the entire operation just to keep his people alive.
That analogy holds up perfectly. Balboa's initial success stems entirely from desperate ground-level survivalism. He understands that a piece of paper from the King of Spain means absolutely nothing if everyone starves to death on the beach.
Exactly.
He builds his authority from the bottom up, based strictly on pragmatism. He founds Santa Maria, and it becomes the very first stable, permanent European town on the American mainland.
But, as with any rogue founder who usurps the board, Balboa has a massive problem hanging over his head. Yes, he survived. Yes, he built a town. But back in Spain, he's technically a usurper.
Oh, absolutely. He's a criminal.
He stripped a royally appointed official of his power. Enciso actually sails back to Spain to report him to King Ferdinand. Balboa knows that the only way he avoids the hangman's noose when the king's justice eventually arrives is if he makes himself far too valuable to kill.
He needs leverage. And in the 16th century Spanish Empire, leverage meant one thing, and that was gold. Lots of it.
Right.
He needs to send such a massive bribe back to the crown that the king will forgive the mutiny and legitimize his rule. But to extract that kind of wealth, he has to completely change his strategy. He transitions from Balboa the survivalist to Balboa the ruthless colonial strategist.
And to get that gold, he has to deal directly with the people who actually own the land.
Yeah.
Because this wasn't some empty wilderness.
Not at all. The Isthmus of Panama was a densely populated, intensely complex geopolitical landscape governed by various indigenous chiefdoms, primarily the Quarequá people.
So how does he approach them?
To maintain his precarious hold on power, Balboa had to integrate his tiny Spanish force into that existing political ecosystem.
And his method for doing this was a highly effective, incredibly manipulative carrot-and-stick approach. He knew European survival relied on working with the people, but his version of working with them was essentially running an extortion racket.
Yeah, a protection racket, basically.
Let's break down the carrot first. How does he actually forge an alliance when they don't even speak the same language?
Well, it was incredibly rudimentary at first. It involved gestures, the exchange of basic goods, and unfortunately the use of captives who were forced to quickly learn Spanish to act as intermediaries.
That makes sense.
But Balboa's primary strategy was identifying the existing rivalries between the different Cueva caciques, or paramount chiefs. He realized these chiefdoms were already competing for resources and prestige, so he inserts himself as a mercenary force.
He goes to a powerful Quarequá chief named Carreta, and he basically says, "Ally with me, feed my men, and I will use my steel and my weapons to help you crush your indigenous enemies." And to seal this alliance, Carreta offers Balboa his own daughter.
Yes, and this is a crucial point regarding how history is remembered and manipulated. If you look at Panamanian folklore today or read 20th century literature, you will see this woman referred to universally as an Ayansi.
Oh, I've heard that name.
Right. You'll hear tragic, romanticized tales of her love for Balboa. But our historical sources are incredibly clear on this. The name Anayensi is a complete fiction.
Wait, really?
Yes. It is a 20th century literary invention popularized by a 1934 novel written by Octavio Méndez Pereira.
Wait, so what was her actual name?
We don't know. Her actual name was never recorded by any of the Spanish chroniclers.
That is just deeply tragic. It's like erasing her humanity twice over. First, the Spanish conquerors strip her of her identity, recording her in their ledgers merely as Carreta's daughter, just a piece of diplomatic property.
Yeah.
And then, 400 years later, modern novelists invent a fake, exotic-sounding name to turn a story of colonial subjugation into a digestible, romantic soap opera.
It perfectly highlights the first-person gap we face when studying this era. We are relying entirely on the diaries and reports of the conquerors. This unnamed woman essentially cemented the survival of the Spanish beachhead on the mainland by securing the food supply. Yet she isn't afforded the basic dignity of her own name in the historical record.
This alliance with Carreta does exactly what Balboa needs. It gives him a secure base, a steady flow of food, and indigenous allies. And this leads to the massive tipping point of the entire story. Balboa, along with his new indigenous allies, travels to the territory of another, much wealthier chief named Comogur.
Comoger's court was highly sophisticated. When the Spanish arrive, Comoger hosts them, and as a gesture of his own wealth and power, he gives the Spanish a significant amount of finely worked gold jewelry and artifacts.
Which is just customary diplomacy for them.
Right. And what happens next perfectly encapsulates the cultural collision between the two worlds.
The Spanish completely lose their minds. The moment the gold is brought out, the diplomatic facade shatters. The soldiers start yelling, drawing weapons, and physically fighting each other in the dirt over the scales used to weigh the gold.
It's pure greed.
They're screaming over who gets what fraction of an ounce.
And Comoger's eldest son, a young man named Panquiaco, is watching this display. You have to imagine it from his perspective. These heavily armed, terrifying foreigners who claim to be emissaries of a great king are rolling around in the dirt, abandoning all dignity for a soft, relatively useless yellow metal.
Panquiaco is just disgusted. He walks right up to the squabbling Spaniards, punches the weighing scales, knocks the gold onto the ground, and basically berates them.
He really lets them have it.
The chronicles record him, essentially saying, "If you are so ravenously hungry for this metal that you will destroy your own alliances and fight each other for it, why are you bothering with these little trinkets? I can tell you where to find as much as you want."
Panquiaco tells them that if they cross the jagged mountain range to the south, they will find a great sea. And he tells them that along the shores of that sea there are kingdoms where the people are so wealthy they eat and drink from bowls made of solid gold.
He is, of course, describing the Pacific Ocean, and he is filtering down early rumors of the massive Inca Empire located far to the south in the Andes.
Exactly. Panquiaco likely just wanted these greedy, chaotic mercenaries to leave his father's lands and go bother someone else.
Like, go over that mountain and leave us alone.
Right. But instead, he inadvertently altered the course of global history. He handed Balboa the exact piece of information he needed.
The idea of this great sea and a golden empire becomes an absolute obsession for Balboa. This is his ticket to avoiding the hangman. If he can discover this ocean for the king, he becomes untouchable.
He becomes a hero.
But to get there, he can't just rely on diplomacy. And this is where his carrot and stick approach comes out. And I want to warn you, the listener, this part of the deep dive gets incredibly dark.
We must be very sober and analytical about this. For centuries, older textbooks and nationalist histories have portrayed Balboa as the good conquistador. You know, a more enlightened, peaceful explorer compared to the monsters who came later, simply because he formed the alliance with Carreta.
Right, they try to sanitize it.
But that is a false, completely sanitized narrative. The expedition he mounts to find the southern sea was soaked in blood.
As Balboa pushes his forces across the isthmus toward the mountains, he enters the territory of a chief named Quarequá. Quarequá wants nothing to do with the Spanish extortion racket. He blocks their path with his warriors, and Balboa does not attempt to negotiate. He unleashes an absolute slaughter.
The tactical imbalance was horrific. Balboa's men utilized steel swords, which could sever limbs in a single strike, and crude firearms. But the true terror came from their biological weapons, and that was the war dogs.
Tell me about these dogs, because they weren't just guard dogs, right?
Not at all. These were massive breeds, mostly Alanos, Mastiffs, and Wolfhounds. They were often outfitted in padded armor or even chainmail to protect them from arrows.
Wait, armored wolves?
Essentially, yes. They were specifically trained from birth to hunt, run down, and rip human beings to pieces. Balboa's famous dog, Leoncico, was recorded as being so lethal in battle that he actually drew a crossbowman's salary, and he earned Balboa a significant share of gold for his quote-unquote services.
That is insane.
At the Battle of Quarequá, these dogs were unleashed into the indigenous ranks, causing mass panic and devastating casualties. Hundreds of Quarequá's people were massacred.
But the violence doesn't stop on the battlefield, because what happens next is a documented atrocity that requires us to really examine the worldview of the Spanish conquerors.
What's fascinating here, and I use that word in a strictly analytical sense, is how the primary Spanish chronicler, Peter Martyr de Anghiera, records the aftermath of the battle. The Spanish forces enter Quarequá's settlement and breach the chief's court. Inside, they discover a group of roughly 40 individuals dressed in what the Spanish explicitly perceive as women's clothing.
And Balboa, upon seeing them, immediately orders his war dogs to tear these 40 people apart. Alive. He feeds human beings to the dogs. I'm struggling to understand how a leader makes that leap. Why target these specific people in the court with such a specific, grotesque form of execution?
To understand the why, we have to examine the rigid religious and legal framework the Spanish brought with them. Anthropologists and historians widely agree today that these 40 individuals were likely third gender or two-spirit people.
Okay, can you explain what that means in this context?
Sure. In many pre-Columbian indigenous societies across the Americas, gender was not the strict, immutable binary that 16th century Catholic Europe demanded. These individuals often held respected, sometimes spiritual, ceremonial, or diplomatic roles within the chief's court.
But the Spanish, arriving straight out of the era of the Spanish Inquisition, don't see spiritual leaders. They see an absolute violation of their religious reality.
Exactly. The Spanish Inquisition had embedded a deeply rigid, binary worldview into the culture. Any deviation was categorized under a specific legal and theological term, which they called the abominable sin. They framed the existence of these two-spirit people exclusively as sodomy.
And that framing is what makes it a legal issue for them.
Yes, and this is crucial. Under the legal framework of the Spanish conquest, accusations of the abominable sin were a recognized legal loophole used to strip indigenous people of whatever minor protections they had. It completely justified the absolute worst extremes of lethal violence.
So it wasn't just a battlefield frenzy. It was a calculated, religiously motivated execution. They used the accusation of sodomy as a legal justification to annihilate people who threatened their worldview.
Yes, and Peter Martyr de Anghiera, who is writing his chronicle back in the safety of the Spanish court, heavily moralizes this scene. He doesn't write about it as a war crime or a senseless slaughter of non-combatants. He frames Balboa's actions as a righteous, divine cleansing.
Unbelievable.
He writes that the Spanish acted as agents of God, punishing unnatural behavior.
It literally becomes a PR tool for the empire. It's propaganda. Decades later, a Flemish engraver named Theodore de Bry creates these incredibly graphic, horrifying engravings showing Balboa's dogs disemboweling these 40 people. And those images are circulated all over Europe.
This brings us to the devastating historical reality of the Cueva people. Whether it was through violent genocidal incursions like the massacre at Quarequá, the grueling forced labor they were subjected to, or the wave of European diseases that swept through the region, the Cueva society was effectively completely annihilated within a few decades of contact.
The alliances didn't save them. The resistance didn't save them.
They were systematically wiped off the board, and that creates this immense void in the historical record. We're trying to reconstruct this incredibly rich, complex civilization entirely through the heavily biased, self-serving reports of the men who actively destroyed them. It had its own intricate politics, trade networks, and fluid gender expressions, and we only know about it from the people who wiped it out.
Here's where it gets really interesting to me, conceptually. It forces you to completely reject the simple great man theory of history. You look at the sources, and Balboa is navigating this geopolitical landscape by adopting indigenous customs and using careful diplomacy on a Tuesday, and then literally unleashing armored warhounds to tear spiritual leaders apart on a Wednesday.
It requires the modern student of history to hold two contradictory facts in their mind simultaneously. Vasco Núñez de Balboa possessed extraordinary, almost superhuman leadership and survival skills, and he utilized those exact skills to enact a genocidal campaign of terror.
So leaving the slaughtered village of Quarequá behind, driven purely by Panquiaco's rumor of the Great Sea and the Golden Kingdoms, Balboa organizes his final push. It is September 1st, 1513. He leaves his coastal settlement. He takes roughly 190 Spanish soldiers, and crucially, he brings several hundred indigenous warriors and porters.
We really have to emphasize the role of those indigenous guides. Balboa didn't discover the route. The route was shown to him by the people who had lived there for millennia. He was simply following their directions.
But the physical reality of this trek cannot be overstated. Let's talk about the Darien Gap. At the point they cross the isthmus, it is roughly 45 miles wide as the crow flies. Now, in a modern car on a paved highway, 45 miles takes you about 45 minutes.
But they are not on a highway. To this day, the Darien Gap remains one of the most impenetrable, hostile jungle environments on the planet. There are no roads through it, even now.
Walk us through the mechanics of that march. What does it actually feel like for these 190 men?
It is a slow-motion descent into physical breakdown. The humidity is consistently near 100%. That means your sweat doesn't evaporate, so your body simply cannot cool itself down.
Sounds miserable.
Now imagine marching through that while wearing a steel breastplate, a helmet, and carrying heavy weapons. They are wading through knee-deep, stagnant swamps. They are hacking their way through dense thickets of razor-sharp sawgrass that literally slices through their clothing and leaves their skin covered in infected cuts.
And almost immediately, the biology of the jungle starts taking them out.
They begin dropping from sheer heat exhaustion. But worse are the vector-borne diseases. They are being bitten constantly by mosquitoes carrying malaria and yellow fever.
And they had no idea what was happening, right?
Right. They didn't know the germ theory of disease. They didn't know the mosquitoes were killing them. Men are collapsing with hemorrhagic fevers, bleeding from their eyes and mouths, suffering from extreme dysentery from drinking contaminated swamp water. Balboa is constantly forced to leave sick and dying men behind at indigenous villages along the route. It is a grueling, agonizing crawl across the spine of the continent.
It takes them nearly a month to travel 45 miles. Think about the math on that. They're moving at a pace of less than 2 miles a day. It is agonizing, machete-swinging, blood-soaked progress. Until finally, we reach late September. The historical sources debate the exact date. Some say September 25th, others the 27th, 1513. But they're finally high up in the mountains, and the indigenous guides halt the column.
They point up to a bald, treeless ridge just ahead of them, and they tell Balboa through the translators, from the top of that peak you can see the water.
And here we see Balboa's deep, almost theatrical understanding of power and historical legacy. He commands his entire force, every single Spaniard, every indigenous guide, to halt. He strictly forbids anyone to follow him. He climbs that final steep ascent to the summit entirely alone.
Why do you think he does that? Why not bring his lieutenants?
Well, presumably because he understands the political weight of being the absolute first.
No, exactly. He knows that his entire legal defense against the hangman's noose rests on this exact moment. He needs to be the sole European discoverer.
So he crests the ridge alone. He reaches the summit, and he looks south. And spreading out to the horizon, glittering under the sun, is a vast, endless blue expanse. The chronicles say he falls to his knees in the dirt. He names it the Mar del Sur, the South Sea. Because based on the weird, twisting geography of the Panamanian Isthmus, he was actually looking geographically south at that specific moment.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it is very difficult for us today, having grown up looking at globes and satellite imagery, to grasp why this specific view was so earth-shattering.
Yeah, it just seems like, oh, he saw some water.
Right. But up until that exact moment on that peak in September 1513, the stubborn, prevailing European consensus was entirely wrong.
Christopher Columbus went to his grave stubbornly believing that the landmass he had hit in the Caribbean was just the ragged, remote eastern edge of the Asian continent. He thought if he just pushed far enough inland, he would eventually bump into the Grand Khan's palace in China.
Yes, the European mental map was fundamentally flawed. But Balboa, standing on that peak, shatters that illusion permanently. By physically confirming the existence of a massive second ocean separating the landmass from Asia, He proves once and for all that the Americas are a distinct continent-sized landmass. It is definitively a new world.
This single geographic realization completely rewires global history.
Yeah.
It changes imperial strategy. Suddenly, Panama isn't just a frustrating swamp blocking the way to China. It becomes the ultimate global choke point, the narrowest gateway between the Atlantic and the Pacific.
It sets the stage for centuries of global trade, from the Spanish silver fleets to the eventual construction of the Panama Canal. All of it hinges on the geographical truth confirmed on that ridge.
And before we move off this mountain, I have to share this amazing piece of literary trivia from our sources. It perfectly illustrates how history gets mangled. Hundreds of years after this event, the great English Romantic poet John Keats writes one of the most famous poems in the English language on first looking into Chapman's Homer.
Oh, I love this story.
He wants to capture the ultimate feeling of human awe and discovery. So he writes a famous stanza about a man staring at the Pacific Ocean, standing silent upon a peak in Darien. But Keats, in the poem, credits the discovery to stout Cortez.
Hernan Cortez, the man who conquered the Aztec Empire in Mexico and who was absolutely nowhere near Panama in 1513.
Exactly. Keats completely messed up his history books. He mixed up Cortez and Balboa, but when his friends and editors pointed out this massive geographical error prior to publication, Keats realized something awful. The name Balboa has 3 syllables and Cortez has 2. Balboa completely ruined the poetic meter of the line, so he just left it.
That is hilarious.
To this day, English literature students all over the world memorize a masterpiece poem that credits the wrong conqueror simply because Cortez fit the rhythm better.
It is a wonderful, frustrating example of how narrative aesthetics so often overwrite historical fact, and it's a theme we will see continuously in this deep dive, because 4 days after that moment on the peak, on September 29th, Balboa officially descends from the mountains and reaches the actual shoreline at the Gulf of San Miguel.
And he doesn't just look at it. He wades directly into the salt water. He is fully armored in steel plate. He holds a drawn sword in his right hand and a banner bearing the image of the Virgin Mary in his left. And shouting over the waves, he formally claims this ocean, all the islands within it, and every single landmass that its waters touch, for the crown of Castile. It is an act of staggering audacity.
He is at the absolute peak of his glory. He has secured a continent-defining victory. He believes he has made himself untouchable back in Spain. He is the master of the isthmus.
But the tragedy of Balboa, or the karmic retribution, depending on how you view his atrocities, is that the clock had already run out on him. Because long before the news of this monumental, map-shattering discovery could cross the Atlantic Ocean and reach King Ferdinand in Spain, the king had already put the bureaucratic wheels in motion to replace him.
Because remember, the speed of information in the 16th century is dictated by the wind. Back in Spain, Balboa is still officially viewed as the rogue startup founder who illegally usurped Enciso's power. He is a traitor on paper. So King Ferdinand appoints a new, official, legally sanctioned governor for the territory, which the crown has optimistically named Castilla del Oro, meaning Golden Castile.
And the man the king chooses for the job is the absolute worst nightmare for a guy like Balboa.
Enter Pedrarias Dávila.
Pedrarias. Just his nickname alone tells you everything you need to know about his management style. They called him Furor Domini, the wrath of God. He is an elderly, deeply suspicious, terrifying, rigid aristocrat.
In 1514, Pedrarias arrives on the Caribbean coast of Panama with a massive, royally backed fleet. The sources tell us he brought a staggering force of somewhere between 1,500 to 2,000 colonists. It is an overwhelming show of institutional force and bureaucracy.
So let's break down the dynamic when these two men finally meet. You have Balboa, who learned the rules of the jungle the hard way. He learned that to survive, you have to eat local cassava root, you have to build political alliances with the chiefs, you have to be highly mobile, and you have to strip away European formalities. He represents ultimate pragmatic survivalism.
And then Pedrarias steps off the boat. Pedrarias represents bloated, rigid, uncompromising, aristocratic bureaucracy. Look at who he brought with him. These 2,000 people aren't hardened frontier survivalists. They are minor nobles dressed in velvet and silk, lawyers carrying stacks of royal decrees, accountants, and courtiers.
He drops 2,000 aristocrats into a malaria-infested swamp purely to enforce royal will and extract gold. It's the ultimate example of the sunk cost fallacy. The crown invested a fortune in this fleet, so they are going to force the environment to submit no matter what.
And the results are exactly what you would expect when you prioritize bureaucracy over biology. Massive immediate starvation. Within months of arrival, the logistical nightmare of feeding 2,000 extra mouths in a jungle settlement causes a total collapse.
I can't even imagine.
You have these Spanish aristocrats who arrived in velvet coats, literally wandering the muddy streets, trading priceless family heirlooms for a single piece of moldy bread, or just dropping dead of yellow fever in the dirt.
Wait, if they're starving, why don't they just use Balboa's alliances to get food? I mean, he set up the supply chains.
Because Pedrarias' approach is not to adapt to the environment or respect indigenous treaties. His approach is sheer terror. He immediately breaks Balboa's carefully constructed alliances and attempts to violently subjugate the surrounding chiefdoms to steal their food.
Which obviously backfires.
Completely. It only incites massive indigenous uprisings and cuts off the food supply entirely.
It's like a corporate takeover where the new CEO brings in 1,000 overpaid middle managers, crashes the company's revenue, and immediately sidelines the only guy, Balboa, who actually knows the passwords to the servers. Balboa looks at this arriving fleet and realizes his days of absolute, unquestioned rule are over.
But Pedrarias is also trapped in a political bind here. He arrives with a royal mandate to arrest, investigate, and likely execute Balboa for mutiny. But when he anchors his fleet, he finds out that Balboa isn't just a rogue mutineer anymore.
Right, he's the guy who found the ocean.
Exactly. He is the man who just discovered the South Sea. He is beloved by the local veteran colonists who view him as their savior.
And shortly after Pedrarias arrives, ships from Spain finally pull into port carrying new royal decrees from King Ferdinand. The king has received the news of the Pacific Ocean and he is thrilled. The king officially names Balboa the Adelantado of the South Sea. He gives Balboa a massive, prestigious title, an independent salary, and direct legal jurisdiction over the entire Pacific coast.
So Pedrarias' hands are tied. He can't just execute the king's new favorite explorer on day one. It would cause a violent riot among the Darien veterans, and it would completely enrage the crown.
What begins is a deeply toxic, intensely personal, violent Cold War between the two men. It's a high-stakes, bureaucratic chess match played out in a rotting jungle settlement. They're constantly spying on each other, maneuvering legally, trying to bait each other into a fatal mistake.
And the way we remember this conflict today, the way the narrative has been handed down to us through the centuries, is heavily, heavily manipulated by the men who are holding the pens at the time.
Let's talk about that, because this is where the study of history gets really subjective and, frankly, a bit treacherous. Almost everything we know about this specific era, this rivalry, and the Cueva people comes from two primary chroniclers, Gonzalo Fernández de Oviedo and Peter Martyr de Anghiera.
This raises an incredibly important question for anyone trying to understand the past. Who is writing the heroes and the villains? Let's look at Oviedo first. Oviedo was an actual colonial official who spent years in the Americas, and he passionately, deeply, on a personal level, hated Pedrarias Dávila. They were bitter political enemies.
So when Oviedo sits down to write his massive history of the Indies, he isn't objective.
Not even slightly. Oviedo purposefully burnishes Balboa's reputation. He highlights every one of Balboa's successes and downplays his atrocities, specifically to paint Balboa as the noble, competent, pragmatic explorer.
Ah, I see.
And he does this to make his enemy, Pedrarias, look like an even bigger, more incompetent, jealous monster by contrast.
And then you have Anghiera. Anghiera never even crossed the Atlantic Ocean. He was a scholar writing from the comfort of the Spanish court. He gets his information through secondhand reports, interviewing captains and soldiers who came back on ships. And as we saw with the massacre at Quarequá, he heavily moralizes the events to fit a clean European Catholic worldview.
So we have to look critically at the narrative that has dominated textbooks for centuries. The clean morality play of heroic noble Balboa versus monstrous evil Pedrarias is a historical trap. Yes, Pedrarias was a brutal, paranoid, incompetent bureaucrat who caused massive suffering. But Balboa was a ruthless, extortionist agent of empire who fed human beings to dogs.
Right. There are no good guys here.
Exactly. They were both architects of an indigenous apocalypse. Balboa just had better tactical charm on the ground and vastly better PR from Oviedo in the history books.
If you think about it in terms of modern media, if you only get your news from two rival political operatives who hate each other, you have to read very carefully between the lines to find the actual truth. We are viewing the complete destruction of the Cueva people, the real lives of Careta, of Panquiaco, of the thousands who died in the gold mines or from disease, entirely filtered through the political smear campaigns of the men who conquered them. The indigenous voices aren't just quiet, they're actively overwritten by the Spanish bureaucratic soap opera.
That is a tragedy of the colonial archive. The primary sources care far more about the legal maneuvering and political gossip between two Spanish officials than they do about the ancient civilization that was collapsing around them.
Which brings us back to the climax of this political maneuvering. It's around 1517 and 1518. Pedrarias and Balboa are locked in this paranoid stalemate. Pedrarias decides to play a brilliant, twisted psychological game to keep Balboa controlled. He actually betroths Balboa by proxy to his own daughter, Maria de Peñalosa, who is still living back in Spain.
It's a classic mafia tactic. Keep your friends close and keep your brilliant, highly dangerous, popular rival inside the family structure where you can legally and socially monitor his every move. By making Balboa his future son-in-law, Pedrarias expects subordination.
But Balboa refuses to be sidelined. He is restless. He holds the title of Adelantado of the South Sea, and he actually wants to explore it. He remembers Panquiaco's promise of the golden Inca kingdoms to the south. So Balboa does something logistically incredible, almost insane. He establishes a new town on the Caribbean coast called Acla, and he decides to build a fleet of ships to sail the Pacific.
But wait, the timber and the shipyards are on the Caribbean side, and the ocean he wants to sail is on the other side of the mountains.
Right, so he literally has his men and thousands of enslaved indigenous porters cut down massive timber on the Caribbean coast. They shape the heavy wooden hull planks, they gather the iron anchors and the massive cans of sails, and they carry these massive, incredibly heavy ship parts on their backs, hacking their way across the steep, jagged mountains of the Continental Divide to reassemble the ships on the Pacific shore.
It is a staggering feat of engineering and sheer will, and it came at a horrific human cost. The chroniclers note that hundreds, perhaps thousands, of indigenous porters died of exhaustion and abuse during this forced portage across the mountains.
Balboa is obsessed. He is building the independent navy that he intends to use to sail south and conquer Peru. And this sheer display of logistical power and independence is what finally breaks Pedrarias' fragile tolerance. Total paranoia strikes the governor.
Pedrarias looks at Balboa building an independent fleet on the far side of the mountains, far from the governor's watchful eye, and he assumes the worst. He thinks, Balboa isn't exploring for the crown. He's going to board those ships, sail south, break away from Spain entirely, and crown himself the independent king of his own golden empire.
And he can't let that happen.
No. Pedrarias decides the threat is too immense. He has to spring the trap before Balboa can set sail.
Pedrarias sends a seemingly friendly, official letter to Balboa. He summons his son-in-law back to the headquarters at Acla to discuss the funding and logistics for the upcoming southern expedition.
Balboa, perhaps underestimating the lethal depth of Pedrarias' paranoia, or perhaps believing that his fame and his title of Adelantado made him politically untouchable, complies with the order. He leaves his ships behind and steps out of the jungle, heading down the trail toward the town of Acla.
And here we reach the ultimate cinematic betrayal. The man who steps out of the trees to block the path, accompanied by a squad of armed soldiers, the man tasked with arresting Vasco Núñez de Balboa, is none other than his own trusted lieutenant, his longtime comrade in arms, Francisco Pizarro.
The historical irony of that specific moment is just thicker than the jungle canopy they were standing under.
Balboa looks at Pizarro. This is a guy he has fought beside in the mud, starved beside at San Sebastian, a man who marched with him to see the Pacific. And Balboa is stunned. He says, "What is this, Francisco? You are not one to come out to receive me in this fashion." But Pizarro doesn't flinch. He has his orders from the governor. He places his former commander in heavy iron chains.
What follows is a completely rigged kangaroo court. In January 1519, a show trial is convened in Acla, presided over by the Chief Justice, Gaspar de Espinosa. Espinosa is entirely in Pedrarias' pocket. The legal mechanics of the trial were a sham. Balboa is formally condemned for treason and for attempting to incite a rebellion against the crown, specifically for plotting to usurp Pedrarias.
Throughout the trial, Balboa vehemently proclaims his innocence. He points to his massive discoveries, his loyal service to the king, his title. But the verdict was decided before he even walked into the room. Pedrarias needed him dead. In the public square at Acla, Balboa, the man who found the Pacific Ocean, is led to the wooden chopping block alongside 4 of his closest officers.
The scene described by the chroniclers is chilling. They report that Pedrarias Dávila, the wrath of God, watched the entire execution from the shadows. He reportedly hid behind a bamboo lattice wall just off the square so he could intimately witness the death of his hated rival without being seen by the angry crowd of colonists.
The town crier shouts the charges of treason. Balboa shouts back his innocence one last time. The axe falls. Vasco Núñez de Balboa is beheaded.
The execution of Balboa cemented a very dark, very specific precedent for early colonial administration in the Americas. It proved that sheer political terror, jealousy, and bureaucratic paranoia would always ultimately override competence, pragmatism, and discovery. The rigid institution will always eventually eat the rogue founder.
And the ultimate betrayal in this story wasn't just Pedrarias signing the death warrant. The ultimate betrayal was Pizarro. Because think about what happens next in history. Pizarro taps his boss on the shoulder, arrests him, watches his head get chopped off, and then literally steals his dream.
He takes everything.
It was Francisco Pizarro who took the very ships Balboa had dragged across the mountains, sailed south on that very ocean Balboa had discovered, and used Balboa's own intelligence gathering regarding the Inca Empire to conquer Peru. Pizarro stole his life's work.
Pizarro learned the ultimate brutal lesson from observing both of these men. From Balboa, he learned ruthless frontier pragmatism, the utility of terror, and how to operate without support. From Pedrarias, he learned cold institutional treachery and how to manipulate the legal system to eliminate rivals. Pizarro synthesized both methods and applied them to the Andes, with devastating results for the Inca.
So as we wrap up this massive deep dive, let's synthesize everything we've unpacked today. We started by looking at the clean lines on a map. What seems in the sanitized history books like a noble story of heroic geographic discovery, a man standing silently in awe on a mountain peak, is actually a gritty, horrifying, complex tale.
It's so much messier than the textbooks let on.
It's a story of bankrupt survivalists outmaneuvering lawyers, of bureaucratic paranoia suffocating progress, and of horrific, religiously justified violence against the Cueva and Quarequá peoples. It's a story of PR spin by biased chroniclers who wanted to invent pristine heroes and monstrous villains to serve their own political agendas.
The physical reality of the Americas, the existence of a distinct new world, was proven on that mountain ridge in 1513. But the social and political reality of the Americas, the betrayals, the endless resource extraction, the legal justification of atrocities, and the erasure of indigenous identities, was forged in the muddy, violent rivalry between Vasco Núñez de Balboa and Pedrarias Dávila.
The map of the world we accept today was drawn in the blood of those intense interpersonal rivalries. Which leaves us with a lingering, provocative thought for you to mull over long after this deep dive ends. Francisco Pizarro watched Balboa's head fall in the dirt, and then he used Balboa's ships to sail south and violently conquer the Inca. But think about the completely different leadership styles of Balboa and Pedrarias.
Right, what if things had gone differently?
If Pedrarias' institutional paranoia hadn't won the day, if the pragmatist, the alliance-building, rogue startup founder Balboa had been the one to sail into Peru instead of the cold, ruthless Pizarro, how entirely different might the history of the Americas and the survival of its indigenous peoples look today?
It is a fascinating phantom branch of history that we will never get to explore.
But the lines they drew, for better and for worse, are the lines we still live within. Thank you so much for taking this journey into the sources with us. We'll catch you on the next deep dive.